When I called my son to ask what time I should arrive for my grandson's college graduation party, the line went completely dead. Then my daughter-in-law snatched the phone, laughed a sharp sound that reminded me of breaking glass, and said the party had already happened last Sunday. She explicitly told me my rusted pickup truck and flannel work shirts did not fit the aesthetic of the wealthy investor friends they had invited. A week later, they stood at the heavy iron gates of my property, sobbing in the pouring rain and begging for a financial rescue. I looked at them completely unmoved and told them to get off my property forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to family members who mistook your quiet patience for weakness. The smell of raw mahogany and linseed oil filled my workshop. I ran my calloused thumb along the edge of the desk I had been building for 3 months. It was a massive traditional executive desk crafted from a single salvaged mahogany tree I had purchased a decade ago. I had spent countless hours planing the boards, cutting the dovetail joints by hand, and sanding the surface until it felt like smooth glass under my fingertips. I built this desk specifically for my grandson Cameron. He had just finished his degree in architecture, graduating at the top of his class. I wanted him to start his career with something solid, something built with intention and durability. The physical labor had made my shoulders ache, but it was a good kind of pain. It was the pain of providing. I wiped the sawdust from my hands using an old rag. I checked my steel wristwatch. It was Thursday morning. The graduation ceremony had taken place 2 weeks prior, a massive event at the university stadium where I had proudly watched Cameron walk across the stage. Brian. My son had mentioned they were organizing a private celebration for Cameron to follow a gathering to honor his hard work. I had been waiting for the exact details. I picked up my cell phone from the workbench. The screen was smeared with a thin layer of wood dust. I wiped it clean against my jeans and pressed the speed dial for Brian. I listened to the phone ring. 1, 2, 3. I looked at the polished brass handles I still needed to install on the desk drawers. I planned to ask Brian if I should bring my famous smoked brisket to the party, or if they had already hired caterers. Finally, the ringing stopped. The line connected. I said hello, asking Brian what time I should head over to their place on Sunday. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. I could hear the faint sound of jazz music playing in the background, along with the clinking of expensive glassware. Brian cleared his throat. He stumbled over his words, muttering something completely incoherent about schedules and misunderstandings. Then the auditory texture of the call shifted. A sharp rustling sound indicated the phone had been violently pulled from Brian's hand. Melissa spoke. Her voice was dripping with a toxic blend of amusement and absolute condescension. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the small speaker of my phone. She did not bother to offer an excuse or a polite lie. She told me directly that the graduation party had taken place last Sunday at the Oakmont Country Club. I stood frozen in the center of my workshop. The rag slipped from my hand and hit the floor. Melissa continued her tone conversational but laced with venom. She explained that this was an elite networking event. They had invited high-profile venture capitalists and real estate developers. She stated with absolute clarity that my presence would have been an embarrassment. She told me my calloused hands, my faded flannel shirts, and my 20-year-old rusted pickup truck did not fit the pristine aesthetic of their guest list. She said I would have ruined the image of success they were trying to project to their investors. Before I could process the sheer cruelty of her words, I heard the distinct click of the call disconnecting. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a flat mechanical sound that replaced the voice of my own family. I did not throw the phone. I did not scream or curse. I placed the device gently onto the workbench beside a set of sharp chisels. I looked at the beautiful mahogany desk I had built with my own hands. The silence in the workshop felt completely different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the realization of a profound betrayal. I walked out of the workshop and climbed into my old, reliable pickup truck. The engine roared to life, a steady mechanical heartbeat. I drove out of my rural property and headed directly toward the upscale suburban neighborhood where Brian and Melissa lived. It took 40 minutes to reach their gated community. I parked my truck 2 blocks away out of sight from their manicured lawn. I walked down the pristine tree-lined sidewalk until I had a clear view of their massive modern estate. The visual confirmation was staggering. 3 large commercial rental trucks were parked in their circular driveway. A crew of professional event workers was actively dismantling a massive, sprawling white luxury tent that covered their entire backyard. I watched as men carried out crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and velvet lounge chairs. This was not a casual backyard barbecue they had simply forgotten to invite me to. This was a calculated, highly financed production. They had deliberately excluded me from celebrating my only grandson's achievement because they viewed my working-class appearance as a liability to their social climbing. I stood on the sidewalk processing the scale of their deception. I felt no urge to march up to their front door and demand an explanation. An argument would be a waste of energy. It would only give them the satisfaction of calling me emotional or unreasonable. The disrespect was absolute, and it required an equally absolute response. I turned away from the sprawling estate and walked back to my truck. My heart rate was steady. The shock had already evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I drove back to my property. I parked the truck and bypassed the workshop entirely. I walked through the front door of my house, the house I had purchased with decades of grueling, relentless labor. I moved down the hallway and stopped in front of the heavy oak door that led to my private home office. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, smelling of old paper and leather. I walked directly to the massive iron safe bolted to the concrete floor in the corner of the room. I spun the combination dial. 32 to the right, 14 to the left, 46 to the right. The heavy internal locking mechanism clicked with a satisfying metallic thud. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside the safe sat stacks of legal documents and property deeds. I reached past them and pulled out a thick, leather-bound master ledger. Imprinted on the front cover in subtle gold lettering were the words, Carter Holdings. I carried the heavy ledger to my desk and turned on the brass reading lamp. I opened the book to the most recent financial summaries. Brian and Melissa operated under the assumption that I was just a retired mechanic surviving on a modest monthly pension. They treated me with the disdain reserved for the powerless. They had absolutely no idea that 10 years ago I had quietly sold my commercial equipment leasing firm for $40 million. I had placed every single cent into an ironclad blind trust to ensure Brian would never become a lazy, entitled heir. I looked at the complex financial webs documented in the ledger. They thought they had outgrown me. They thought they were the architects of their own success. They were wrong. I closed the ledger, the sound echoing in the quiet room. I was no longer a discarded grandfather. I was the CEO of Carter Holdings, and it was time to conduct a complete audit of my son's arrogant life. I left the heavy ledger on the desk in my home office and walked back out to my truck. The drive from my quiet rural property to the towering glass structures of the downtown financial district took exactly 1 hour. The morning traffic was heavy, but I did not mind the delay. It gave me time to lock away any lingering paternal weakness. I navigated my battered pickup truck into the subterranean parking garage of the tallest skyscraper in the city. I parked perfectly between a silver sports car and a black luxury sedan. I stepped out, smoothing the wrinkles of my flannel shirt, and walked with purpose toward the private elevator reserved for executive clients. The polished steel doors opened onto the 50th floor, revealing the sprawling, marble-lined reception area of the city's most ruthless corporate law firm. The receptionist, a young woman in a meticulously tailored suit, looked up from her dual monitors. For a fraction of a second, her eyes registered confusion at my worn work boots and faded denim jeans. Then she recognized my face. She stood up immediately, her posture straightening into a rigid line of respect, and offered a polite greeting, referring to me clearly as Mr. Carter. She did not ask if I had an appointment. She simply pressed a button on her desk phone and told me that Stuart was ready for me in the corner office. I walked down the long, silent corridor passing glass-walled conference rooms where men in $1,000 suits argued over corporate mergers. I reached the heavy oak door at the very end of the hall and opened it. Stuart sat behind a massive desk overlooking the sprawling city skyline. Stuart had been my lead corporate attorney for 20 years. He was a man who dealt exclusively in facts, numbers, and legally binding consequences. He looked up from his paperwork, removed his wire-framed reading glasses, and gestured for me to sit down. He noted out loud that I rarely visited the office without a scheduled quarterly review. I took the leather chair across from him and told him that a sudden change in family dynamics required an immediate comprehensive audit of all my assets. Stuart opened his laptop and typed in a highly secure authorization code. He asked me what exactly had triggered this unscheduled visit. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told him Brian had just hosted a lavish college graduation party for Cameron at the Oakmont Country Club and had explicitly banned me from attending because my working-class appearance would offend his wealthy guests. Stuart stopped typing. He looked at me, his expression hardening into cold anger. He knew the truth about my life, a truth Brian was entirely blind to. Stuart brought up the master file for the blind trust on his screen. He leaned back in his leather chair and reminded me of the exact conversation we had in this very room 10 years ago. We discussed the day I signed the paperwork to sell my commercial equipment leasing firm. The buyout had been for a staggering $40 million in cash. Stuart recalled how Brian had just started asking for massive loans to fund his absurd lifestyle choices, assuming he would eventually inherit my entire business. I told Stuart that day that I would rather burn the money than watch my son use it to become a lazy, arrogant parasite. That was the exact reason we established the irrevocable blind trust. I placed every single dollar of the $40 million, along with the deeds to my personal properties, directly into the trust. I appointed a neutral third-party management firm to handle the investments. To Brian and to the rest of the world, it appeared as though my business had simply failed, and I had retired with nothing but a meager pension and a small plot of land. I wanted Brian to build his own life from the ground up to understand the true value of hard work. Instead, he had married a woman obsessed with social status and spent his entire life pretending to be wealthy while looking down on the man who had secretly secured his future. I told Stuart I wanted to know exactly how Brian was funding his current lifestyle. A massive party at the Oakmont Country Club cost tens of thousands of dollars. Brian managed a mid-level regional sales team, and his wife ran a failing interior design studio. The math simply did not add up. I instructed Stuart to run a full financial background check on their recent activities, leveraging the private investigators our firm kept on retainer. I wanted to see their debts, their loans, and every single desperate move they had made to maintain their fake affluent image. Stuart nodded in agreement and began typing rapidly. He accessed the peripheral banking networks and public financial registries. For several minutes, the only sound in the large office was the sharp clicking of his keyboard. Then the steady rhythm of his typing suddenly stopped. The silence in the room stretched out, growing tense and heavy. Stuart leaned closer to his high-resolution monitor, his eyes narrowing as he read a newly generated financial report. He clicked on another secure link, opening a scanned legal document pulled directly from the county clerk database. Stuart looked up from the screen. His professional, detached demeanor was completely gone, replaced by a look of absolute grim severity. He turned the laptop around and pushed it across the smooth glass desk toward me. He told me that we did not need to hire a private investigator to find out how Brian was financing his fake life. He stated that the system had just flagged a massive, highly irregular transaction tied directly to my legal name. He pointed a steady finger at the digital document displayed on the screen and told me to look closely at the signature line at the very bottom of the final page. I leaned forward and examined the bright screen. I recognized the official formatting of the document immediately. It was a commercial bridge loan application for $3 million. But that was not what made my blood run cold. What held my complete attention was the specific asset listed as collateral for the massive loan and the familiar signature endorsing the entire fraudulent transaction. I stared at the forged signature on the screen, feeling a profound shift in my chest. It was not the hot sting of anger, but the cold, heavy weight of absolute certainty. Brian had not simply insulted me. He had committed a felony. I asked Stuart how he had found this document so quickly. Stuart explained the mechanics of the blind trust I had established. When I placed my 60-acre property into the trust 10 years ago, I had instructed the asset managers to place a hard lock on the title. Any attempt to alter the deed, place a lien on the property, or use it as collateral would immediately trigger an automated alert to Stuart's firm. Stuart leaned forward and began typing a rapid sequence of commands into his secure portal. He explained that Brian had submitted the commercial bridge loan application to a private banking institution 3 days ago. The bank had initiated a routine background check on the collateral. The moment the county clerk accessed the digital deed to verify ownership, the security protocols of my trust fired an automatic warning directly to Stuart's server. Brian thought he was dealing with a sleepy rural county office. He had no idea he had just tripped the digital alarm system of a $40 million financial fortress. I told Stuart to dig deeper. I needed to see the entire financial foundation of my son's life. Stuart activated his firm's forensic accounting software. He possessed legal access to peripheral banking networks that allowed him to trace credit inquiries and outstanding debts linked to Brian and Melissa's social security numbers. The large monitor on the desk split into multiple windows, each populating with spreadsheets, credit histories, and banking statements. The reality of their fake affluent life was laid bare in stark, undeniable numbers. Stuart pointed to a column highlighted in red. He explained the current state of Melissa's interior design business. She portrayed herself as a highly sought-after designer for the wealthy elite. The numbers told a completely different story. Her commercial lease in the downtown district was 3 months past due. She owed massive sums to independent contractors, furniture suppliers, and fabric importers. Her business accounts were completely drained, operating on a high-interest line of credit that had been maxed out weeks ago. She was facing imminent bankruptcy and multiple civil lawsuits from unpaid vendors. Then Stuart opened Brian's financial profile. Brian had always boasted about his lucrative career as a regional sales director. The records showed his base salary was painfully average. He had no substantial savings. Every single dollar he earned went directly toward paying the leases on their 2 luxury vehicles, the mortgage on their massive suburban home, and the minimum payments on 5 different premium credit cards. They were drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, terrified that their wealthy social circle would discover they were completely broke. This explained the desperate need for a $3 million commercial bridge loan. They needed a massive, immediate injection of cash to pay off the angry vendors, save the design studio from foreclosure, and maintain their illusion of wealth. But no legitimate bank would approve a loan of that magnitude without substantial collateral. That was when Brian decided to steal his own father's land. I asked Stuart to pull up the recent charges on their maxed-out credit cards. I wanted to see the exact financial footprint of the graduation party at the Oakmont Country Club. Stuart isolated the transactions from the past 14 days. The list of expenditures scrolled down the screen, painting a picture of staggering, reckless extravagance. They had spent $8,000 on vintage champagne and top-shelf liquor. They had paid $12,000 for the rental of the massive white luxury tents and the crystal chandeliers I had seen being dismantled on their lawn. They had hired a premium catering service for another $15,000. They had financed this entire charade using a high-interest credit card they could not possibly pay off. I looked at the massive total and felt a deep sense of confusion. You do not spend $35,000 of borrowed money to celebrate a college graduation. Something was entirely wrong with the narrative. I told Stuart to find the country club's event manifesto. I needed to know exactly who was in that room. Stuart bypassed a low-level security wall and accessed the country club's vendor portal. He located the official event registry that Brian had submitted to the front gate security team. Stuart clicked a button and the office printer hummed to life. He handed me a crisp white sheet of paper containing the names of the 150 guests who had attended the party. I took my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and put them on. I scanned the list looking for the names of Cameron's college friends. I looked for his architecture professors. I looked for the young men and women he had spent the last 4 years studying with. There was not a single college student on the list. There was not a single professor. Instead, the page was filled with the names of the city's most powerful financial figures. I recognized the names of managing partners from elite private equity firms. I saw the names of aggressive venture capitalists and high-net-worth commercial real estate developers. I saw the names of the exact men who controlled the flow of commercial investments in the downtown district. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, shattering the last illusion I held about my son. This event had absolutely nothing to do with celebrating my grandson's academic achievements. Cameron was merely a decorative prop. The graduation was nothing more than a convenient excuse to get 150 wealthy investors into a room where Brian and Melissa could ply them with expensive alcohol and project an image of massive success. They were using my grandson's milestone as a high-stakes networking event to pitch their failing business and secure the private backing they needed to finalize the fraudulent bridge loan. They had banned me from the party not just because I wore flannel shirts and drove an old truck. They had banned me because my presence would have shattered their carefully constructed lie. They could not risk me mentioning my simple rural life to a private equity investor while they were busy pretending to be part of the elite upper class. I took off my glasses and folded the printed guest list, sliding it into the front pocket of my jacket. The audit was complete and the time for quiet observation had officially ended. Stuart pushed his heavy leather chair back and walked over to the high-capacity printer sitting in the corner of his corner office. The machine hummed loudly, spitting out a thick stack of warm paper. These were the physical loan documents he had managed to pull from the secure financial portal. He carried the massive stack across the room and dropped it directly onto the center of the glass desk between us. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the thick glass was sharp and final. He instructed me to look closely at the very first page of the agreement. It was a commercial bridge loan contract issued by Apex Financial, a private lending institution known throughout the city for utilizing highly aggressive and predatory tactics. Stuart began to break down the exact nature of the financial trap my son had walked into. He explained that traditional banks would never lend a single dollar to people in the current financial situation Brian and Melissa were facing. Traditional commercial lenders require extensive proof of legitimate income, solid credit scores, and a history of successful business operations. Apex Financial did not care about any of those things. They did not care about Brian's average corporate salary or the fact that their credit cards were completely exhausted. Apex Financial only cared about the physical asset securing the debt. The loan was for $3 million, but the terms attached to the money were absolute financial suicide. Stuart traced his silver pen along the fine print at the bottom of the page. The interest rate was locked at a staggering 18%. Furthermore, the entire agreement was structured with a balloon payment. This meant the entire principal balance of $3 million plus all accumulated interest would be due in full in exactly 6 months. I asked Stuart how Brian possibly planned to pay back over $3 million in such a short window of time. Stuart turned to the second section of the printed documents, which detailed the comprehensive business plan Melissa had submitted to the lenders to justify the massive funding. In the official application, Melissa claimed her design studio was on the verge of signing an exclusive multi-million-dollar contract to design the interiors of a massive new luxury hotel being developed in the downtown district. She projected millions in upcoming revenue to cover the loan. However, Stewart had already instructed his paralegals to cross-reference this specific claim. The hotel development group had never even heard of her interior design firm. The entire business plan was a complete fabrication, a desperate lie constructed solely to secure the cash. Stewart then pulled a separate, thick red folder from his lower desk drawer. He stated that we needed to look much closer at the true catastrophic state of Melissa's interior design business. He opened the folder to reveal copies of 4 separate civil lawsuits filed in the county court over the past 2 weeks. Melissa had not just been failing to pay her commercial rent or her suppliers. She had been actively defrauding her own wealthy clients. Stewart explained the exact mechanics of her crumbling business model. She required her affluent clients to pay a 50% cash retainer up front, claiming the money was needed to purchase custom luxury furniture and imported European fabrics. However, Melissa never ordered the materials. Stewart pointed to the bank statements attached to the legal filings. Melissa had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in client retainers and funneled the money directly into her personal checking accounts. She had committed the crime of commingling funds. She used her clients' money to pay the lease on her luxury vehicles, to buy expensive designer clothing, and to fund the extravagant graduation party I had just discovered. Her clients had finally realized the furniture was never arriving. They were now demanding their money back, but the bank accounts were completely empty. If she did not secure this $3 million bridge loan by Friday, to pay them back, the civil lawsuits would immediately be upgraded to criminal charges for grand larceny. That was the true reason for their absolute desperation. They were not simply trying to save a failing design studio. Melissa was desperately trying to stay out of a state penitentiary. Brian was acting as her willing accomplice, perfectly willing to sacrifice my land to cover up her criminal activities. I looked at the loan documents again, focusing my attention on the specific section detailing the collateral. My 60-acre property was listed in bold black ink, recently appraised at $4.5 million. Stewart explained the predatory strategy of Apex Financial. The lenders knew Brian could not possibly pay the loan back in 6 months. They were entirely counting on him to default. When Brian inevitably failed to make the balloon payment, Apex Financial would immediately foreclose on my property. They would bypass a lengthy court battle because the bridge loan contained a strict, irrevocable forfeiture clause. They intended to seize my 60 acres of pristine, undeveloped land, divide it into lucrative commercial lots, and sell it for double its appraised value. Apex Financial was not in the business of lending money to help struggling businesses. They were in the business of stealing highly valuable assets from desperate fools. And Brian had walked right into their trap, offering the culmination of my life's work as the bait. I asked Stewart how Brian had managed to bypass the strict legal requirements for transferring a property deed in this state. A transfer of this magnitude required a certified, notarized signature to be considered legally binding. Stewart flipped over to the final page of the dense loan agreement. He pointed his pen to the official blue notary stamp pressed into the bottom corner of the paper, resting right next to my perfectly forged signature. Stewart recognized the printed name of the notary public. It belonged to a man who operated out of a sketchy title loan office on the industrial edge of the city, a man widely known in legal circles to bend the rules for a large cash bribe. Brian had paid a corrupt official to validate the forged signature, elevating his reckless actions from simple fraud to a severe federal crime. Stewart leaned back in his heavy leather chair, folding his hands together on his lap. He looked at me with a gaze of absolute professional seriousness. He proceeded to outline my legal options. He told me that we possessed more than enough undeniable evidence right now to contact the federal authorities. If we handed this thick file over to the district attorney today, Brian and Melissa would be arrested before the loan funds were ever dispersed. They would face decades in federal prison for bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Stewart warned me that if I allowed this loan to officially process, I risked entering a massive, expensive legal battle to reclaim my own land from Apex Financial. I sat in the heavy leather chair, absorbing the complete and utter devastation of my son's choices. I felt no sorrow, no pity, and no paternal weakness. I felt only a cold, mechanical resolve settling into my chest. Brian had made a calculated decision to destroy my life in order to save his own fake reality. He viewed me as a disposable resource, a naive old man he could easily steal from. I looked Stuart directly in the eyes and told him that calling the authorities now would be far too quiet. It would allow them to hide behind closed doors and quiet plea bargains. I instructed Stuart to draft a certified, legally binding letter of fraudulent collateral. We were not going to stop the loan today. We were going to let them believe they had won. We would let them gather their wealthy investors and celebrate their false victory on Friday night. And then I would tear their entire world apart in front of the very people they had sacrificed me to impress. I asked Stuart to isolate the specific deed transfer document from the massive stack of printed financial records. I needed to see the exact mechanism of my son's betrayal with my own eyes. Stuart pulled a single dense page from the pile and placed it squarely in the center of the glass desk. This was the official county transfer application. It was the primary legal instrument required to pledge a physical property as collateral for a commercial loan. I looked at the property description block located at the top of the form. There, typed in rigid, uncompromising black ink, was the exact legal plotting for my 60-acre estate. This was not just a random piece of real estate. Those 60 acres represented the culmination of my entire life's labor. It was the land where I had built my workshop, the very place I had spent the last 3 months carefully crafting Cameron's mahogany desk. I had purchased that specific parcel of land 30 years ago, paying for it with the grueling, exhausting profits from my early days in the equipment leasing business. The property was a sanctuary surrounded by old-growth oak trees and a quiet freshwater creek. It was the only place I found absolute peace after my wife passed away. Brian knew exactly what this land meant to me. He had grown up running through those woods. He knew it was my permanent home. And yet he had coldly offered it up to a predatory lending firm to cover the massive debts of his wife's fraudulent design business. I read the dense legal paragraphs detailing the transfer of rights. The document explicitly stated that I, as the sole owner, willingly and knowingly surrendered all equity in the property to secure the $3 million commercial bridge loan. It contained aggressive clauses acknowledging the immediate risk of foreclosure upon default. It was a document entirely designed to strip a person of their most valuable asset without any room for legal recourse. The sheer audacity required to submit such a form was staggering. Brian had walked into a title office, looked a government official directly in the eye, and presented this paperwork as authentic. I moved my gaze down to the bottom of the page. I needed to see the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to see exactly how Brian had managed to convince the notary public that I had actually consented to this financial suicide. My eyes locked onto the primary signature line. A cold, heavy sensation spread rapidly through my chest, completely replacing any residual anger with a chilling sense of absolute horror. Right there, resting on the thick white paper, was my name. It was not a clumsy attempt at forgery. It was not a rushed scribble or a careless imitation done in a moment of panic. It was a flawless, perfect replica of my exact signature. I leaned closer to the desk, tracing the blue ink strokes with my eyes. The capital letter had the exact same sharp, distinctive angle I had used since I was 20 years old. The loops of the lowercase letters carried the exact same fluid motion. Even the slight, deliberate tail at the very end of my last name was perfectly duplicated. I realized the terrifying implication of what I was looking at. A forgery of this incredible caliber could not be produced spontaneously. It required intense, calculated, and repetitive practice. I know the mechanics of handwriting. A standard forgery usually shows tiny hesitations, small pools of ink where the pen stops as the forger tries to remember the next stroke. This signature had none of that. The ink flowed smoothly and confidently. Brian had deliberately studied my handwriting for a long time. He had likely taken old birthday cards, canceled checks, or personal letters I had sent him over the years. He had sat at his desk in his expensive suburban home, carefully copying the specific movements of my hand, practicing over and over again until he could replicate my identity with absolute, terrifying perfection. This was not a crime of desperate opportunity. This was a premeditated psychological violation. My own son had spent countless hours learning how to steal my identity so he could seamlessly steal my home. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with him 30 years ago, holding his small hand in mine, teaching him how to properly grip a pen and write his own name. I had taught him how to form his letters with pride. Now, decades later, he had weaponized that very skill against me. I thought about the phone call from the day before. I thought about Melissa laughing at me over the receiver, mocking my work boots and my rusted truck. While she was publicly humiliating me and intentionally keeping me away from my grandson's graduation party, Brian was privately mastering the forgery required to leave me completely homeless. They had worked together, operating as a synchronized, ruthless team of predators. They believed my quiet nature and simple clothing meant I was a weak, easily manipulated target. I looked up from the fraudulent document and met Stuart's steady gaze. He did not offer any empty words of comfort. He knew that sympathy was entirely useless in a room where facts and undeniable evidence ruled. I tapped my calloused index finger against the forged blue ink on the page. I told Stuart that this signature proved Brian possessed a level of malice and entitlement I had never truly understood. I had spent my life trying to protect him from the corrupting influence of unearned wealth. I had built the blind trust specifically to teach him the vital value of hard work and integrity. But the rot had clearly taken hold deep inside his character. The perfect forgery resting on the desk was the ultimate proof that Brian was completely beyond any form of salvation or paternal rescue. He had crossed a legal and moral boundary that could never be uncrossed. He had weaponized his intimate knowledge of me to execute a highly sophisticated federal financial crime. I folded the deed transfer document carefully, making sure the perfect forgery was safely protected inside the crease. I placed the paper into the inside breast pocket of my jacket. The visual confirmation was the final fuel my mind required. The audit was officially over. I possessed the undeniable proof of their betrayal. I stood up from the leather chair, feeling the weight of the document against my chest. The time for silent observation had ended. It was time to step directly into their fake world and burn their false reality completely to the ground. I left the towering glass structure of the financial district and navigated my truck toward the historic arts sector of the city. This was the most expensive retail corridor in the entire state. The narrow, pristine streets were lined with imported luxury vehicles, private valet stands, and high-end commercial galleries. I parked my battered 20-year-old pickup truck directly in front of a sprawling storefront featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The elegant gold lettering beautifully etched into the heavy glass read, "Melissa Carter Interiors." I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, with the engine idling, and looked through the immaculate glass. The irony of the visual display in front of me was physically nauseating. I knew the absolute truth about her business now. I knew from the forensic accounting that she was completely bankrupt, facing massive unpayable debts and multiple civil lawsuits for grand larceny. Yet from the outside, the studio looked like an untouchable fortress of immense wealth and high society influence. I turned off the engine and stepped out onto the clean sidewalk. I did not bother to brush the wood dust off my faded green flannel shirt. I did not try to clean the dried mud from my heavy steel-toed work boots. I walked up to the towering glass doors and pushed them open, stepping directly into a world of completely fabricated luxury. The air inside the cavernous room was heavily perfumed with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and fresh bespoke leather. The floors were made of poured concrete that had been polished to a blinding white shine, reflecting the overhead light like a calm lake. Massive custom crystal chandeliers hung from the exposed industrial ceiling, casting a warm, flawless glow over several perfectly arranged seating areas. I slowly walked past a display featuring an imported velvet sofa and a solid marble coffee table. I looked at the extravagant price tags discreetly tucked under the silk cushions. None of this actually belonged to her. Every single piece of high-end furniture and rare textile in this massive room was purchased with money she had explicitly stolen from her trusting clients. It was not a legitimate design studio built on hard work and talent. It was an elaborate theater set built entirely on a foundation of desperate lies and corporate fraud. I stood near the grand entrance, letting my calloused hands rest heavily by my sides. I was the exact physical embodiment of everything my son and his wife despised. I was raw, unpolished reality standing inside their temple of fake perfection. At the far end of the sprawling studio, a group of people was gathered around a massive custom quartz island. Brian and Melissa were standing proudly at the center of the group holding court. They were surrounded by 3 young design assistants who were all wearing sharp, matching black outfits. Brian was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my first car. Melissa was draped in a pure white designer silk dress, and her wrists were glittering with heavy, expensive gold bracelets. The scene looked exactly like a photograph pulled directly from a wealthy lifestyle magazine. Brian held a dark green bottle of vintage champagne in one hand and a tall crystal flute in the other. I watched in absolute silence as he popped the cork with a loud, obnoxious cheer. The young assistants clapped their hands enthusiastically, playing the role of a devoted audience. Brian poured the sparkling golden liquid into the glasses held out by the eager employees. I listened closely as Melissa raised her crystal glass high into the air and proposed a loud, boastful toast to their impending massive expansion. She spoke with supreme artificial confidence about a lucrative new commercial hotel contract and a major influx of corporate capital that was guaranteed to arrive in their banking accounts by Friday morning. She was smiling, a radiant, flawless smile. She was actively and joyfully celebrating the successful theft of my 60-acre property. She was drinking expensive champagne to honor the forged document that would leave me completely homeless. I began walking slowly across the polished white concrete floor. I did not try to soften my footsteps. The heavy rubber tread of my work boots squeaked and echoed loudly through the cavernous room, cutting directly through the smooth jazz music playing softly from the hidden surround sound speakers. I walked past rolls of expensive French silk and displays of imported Italian ceramics. The physical distance between the front door and the quartz island felt like a long corridor of mounting tension. I kept my eyes locked directly on my son. The young assistants were the first to notice the heavy approaching footsteps. They turned their heads away from the celebration. Their enthusiastic smiles instantly vanished and were quickly replaced by looks of utter confusion and mild alarm. They looked down at my dirty boots and my worn clothing, clearly assuming I was a lost construction worker or a confused delivery driver who had wandered through the wrong door. Then Brian turned around. The crystal champagne flute he was holding stopped halfway to his mouth. The confident, arrogant color drained completely out of his face for a fraction of a second. His eyes widened as his brain struggled to process why his father was standing inside his private sanctuary. He quickly recovered his composure and replaced his momentary shock with a rigid mask of intense annoyance. Melissa turned around next. Her eyes scanned me slowly from head to toe, taking in every speck of dust and every frayed thread on my collar. Her beautiful expression twisted into a harsh sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. I had invaded her pristine, curated sanctuary. I had brought the undeniable reality of dirt and honest labor directly into her flawless illusion of high society wealth. The joyful, celebratory energy in the room evaporated instantly, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence that pressed heavily against the walls of the sprawling studio. I stopped walking and stood completely still, waiting for them to speak first. Brian placed his crystal champagne flute onto the quartz island with a sharp click. He did not smile. He separated himself from the group of bewildered design assistants and marched across the polished concrete floor toward me. His posture was rigid with suppressed rage. He closed the distance between us, stopping just inches from my face. He kept his voice low, hissing his words through clenched teeth to prevent the echoes from reaching the back of the studio. He demanded to know what I was doing inside his place of business. He looked down at my faded flannel shirt and my scuffed boots, asking if I had completely lost my mind, coming into a luxury establishment, looking like a vagrant. He told me I was tracking literal dirt into a showroom that catered exclusively to the wealthy elite. Before I could formulate a response, Melissa stepped up beside him. She did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted her employees to witness her authority. She crossed her arms over her expensive white silk dress and looked at me with an expression of profound pity mixed with absolute contempt. She sighed loudly, shaking her head as if dealing with a confused child. She announced to the empty space between us that she supposed it was inevitable I would show up looking for a handout after realizing I had missed the graduation celebration. Melissa unclasped her designer handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a small piece of brightly colored plastic. She held it out toward me between her perfectly manicured fingers. She explained in a slow, patronizing tone that it was a $50 gift card to a chain diner located near the highway. She stated that since I was unable to attend the party at the country club, Brian and she had purchased this card so I could treat myself to a decent hot meal. She pushed the cheap plastic card toward my chest, insisting I take it. She said it was much more suited to my particular tastes than the vintage champagne and imported caviar they had served their actual guests. I slowly raised my hand and took the piece of plastic from her fingers. I looked down at the bright red logo of the roadside diner. The weight of the card felt completely absurd in my palm. My son and his wife were currently attempting to steal a piece of real estate worth $4.5 million from me. They had forged my signature on a federal banking document to secure a $3 million commercial loan to cover their massive criminal debts. Yet here they stood, standing inside a bankrupt design studio funded entirely by stolen client money, arrogantly offering me a $50 gift card as a consolation prize for my absence in their fake lives. The sheer scale of their hubris was staggering. I did not break my silence. I looked from the piece of plastic in my hand up to Melissa's triumphant face. She interpreted my quiet observation as grateful submission. She smiled a cruel, self-satisfied smile and took a step back, aligning herself shoulder to shoulder with Brian. She told me that I needed to understand my place in their new world. She explained that their social circle was composed of high-net-worth individuals, powerful investors, and corporate executives who expected a certain standard of elegance. She stated plainly that my presence was a liability. She told me that looking at my calloused hands and worn clothing made her physically uncomfortable, and it would completely ruin the pristine brand they had worked so hard to build. Brian stepped forward again, emboldened by his wife's ruthless monologue. He pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the street. He dropped all pretense of familial respect. He commanded me to turn around and walk out the door immediately. He stated that they were expecting a very important visit from a private equity representative in less than an hour. He said this meeting would secure their financial future forever, and he absolutely refused to let a stubborn, old-fashioned mechanic sabotage his massive success. He looked me directly in the eyes and told me I was an embarrassment to his professional image. He told me to take the gift card, drive my ugly truck back to the woods, and stay out of his sophisticated life. Brian continued his verbal assault, his voice rising in volume and arrogance. He bragged about the empire he was building. He claimed he had achieved a level of wealth and influence I could never possibly comprehend. He stated that I had spent my entire life working with my hands like a peasant, completely lacking the vision and ambition required to navigate the modern corporate landscape. He declared that he was a self-made man, entirely responsible for his own luxury, and he owed absolutely nothing to a father who had never understood the true meaning of power. I stood completely still, absorbing every single word of his delusional rant. I let him empty his entire arsenal of insults. I watched him inflate his own ego, building his pedestal of lies higher and higher into the air. I did not feel the urge to defend my honor or explain the millions of dollars sitting in my blind trust. I did not feel the need to tell him that the very ground he was standing on was entirely funded by my silent generosity. I simply let him construct his own trap. The higher he climbed on his ladder of arrogance, the more devastating the final fall would be. I slipped the plastic gift card into the front pocket of my flannel shirt, resting it right next to the folded copy of the forged deed transfer. The contrast between the two items resting against my chest was the perfect representation of their fatal miscalculation. I stood my ground, while the echoes of Brian's arrogant insults faded into the cavernous space of the design studio. The plastic gift card rested heavy in my chest pocket, right next to the forged deed. Brian was breathing heavily. His face was flushed with the sheer exertion of his own ego. He was waiting for a reaction. He was waiting for me to shout to defend my pride or to storm out in a fit of typical parental anger. I did none of those things. I simply observed him. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to sit in the uncomfortable atmosphere he had just created. I looked past his tailored navy suit and the expensive gold watch gleaming on his wrist. I kept my voice perfectly level and calm. I asked him a very direct question. I asked him how he had managed to secure such a massive influx of corporate capital in such an incredibly short amount of time. I framed the question not as an accusation, but as a genuine inquiry from a confused old man trying to understand the complexities of modern business. Brian puffed out his chest and sneered. He stated that real money moves rapidly when you possess the right corporate vision. He claimed his wife's business plan was flawless, and the private equity lenders had practically begged him to take their millions. He spoke with the absolute conviction of a man who actually believed his own fabricated reality. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing his great wisdom. I told him I had been reading the financial news lately. I mentioned that aggressive private lending institutions usually demand massive physical collateral before they release that kind of funding. I asked him directly what specific tangible assets he had leveraged to guarantee a multi-million-dollar commercial loan. Melissa rolled her eyes aggressively. She stepped forward and told Brian not to waste his breath explaining high finance to a man who spends his days cutting wood in a dirty shed. She wanted to dismiss me completely, but Brian could not resist the overwhelming urge to brag. His hubris demanded an audience. He looked down at me and stated that he had leveraged his own immense corporate value. He said the banking executives looked at his investment portfolio, his wife's exclusive client list, and their massive future revenue projections, and deemed them a zero-risk investment. He lied flawlessly, without a single hesitation or break in eye contact. This was the critical juncture. I had to give him one final opportunity to show a single shred of human decency or remorse. It was a test I secretly hoped he would pass, even though I knew the undeniable facts resting in my pocket. I looked him dead in the eye and lowered my voice. I asked him if he was absolutely certain his financial foundation was clean. I asked him if he had ever used anything that did not explicitly belong to him to secure this lavish new life. I warned him, speaking slowly and deliberately, that if a man builds his massive house on stolen ground, the entire structure will inevitably collapse and crush him. The question struck a nerve, but it did not strike the nerve of guilt. It struck his fragile pride. He took a hostile step forward, completely invading my personal space. The smell of the expensive vintage champagne was heavy on his breath. He told me I was pathetic and deeply jealous. He said I was projecting my own lifelong financial failures onto his massive, unprecedented success. He swore on his life that every single thing he possessed, every dollar in his bank account, and every contract he signed was earned through his own sheer brilliance. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and stated that I had never given him anything of real value, and he would never need a single thing from me for the rest of his natural life. The confirmation of malice was absolute. He had officially sealed his own fate. He had looked the man whose signature he painstakingly forged straight in the face and lied with terrifying conviction. There was no simple misunderstanding here. There was no desperate panic driving a basically good man to make a temporary mistake. There was only a ruthless predator fiercely protecting his stolen kill. I nodded once, acknowledging his final answer. I told him I understood his position perfectly. I slowly reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my faded green jacket. Brian tensed slightly, clearly thinking I was reaching for the cheap restaurant gift card to throw it back at him in a dramatic display of wounded pride. Melissa crossed her arms, waiting for the emotional outburst she so desperately wanted to witness. Instead, my calloused thumb found the small, tactile slide switch on the side of the digital voice recorder I had hidden inside the lining of my coat. I had activated the recording device the exact moment I parked my truck outside the studio. I pushed the switch down with a firm press. The tiny hidden device clicked softly, saving the last 20 minutes of high-definition audio directly to its internal memory drive. I had captured every single insult, every boastful lie, and his absolute denial of using stolen collateral. I pulled my empty hand out of my pocket and let it fall relaxed to my side. I looked at the group of silent, staring design assistants and then shifted my gaze back to my son and his wife. I did not raise my voice or make a theatrical scene. I simply told Brian to enjoy his expensive champagne. I told him to savor every single drop of it right now, because the taste of victory becomes incredibly bitter when the actual bill finally arrives. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the heavy glass doors. Behind me, I heard Melissa scoff loudly, dismissing my final words as the pathetic rambling of a jealous old man. I heard Brian pour another glass of champagne and loudly declare to the room that it was time to get back to celebrating their massive future. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped back out onto the sunlit concrete sidewalk. The heavy perfumed air of the fake luxury studio vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of city exhaust. I walked back to my truck, holding the audio evidence that would guarantee his complete destruction. I climbed into the cab of my pickup truck and shut the heavy metal door. The sound of city traffic was instantly muffled. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small digital voice recorder. I pressed the playback button just to be absolutely certain. Brian's arrogant voice filled the small cabin of my truck, declaring that he was a self-made man and that he had never used anything that did not belong to him. The audio was crystal clear. I turned the device off and placed it safely back into my pocket alongside the fraudulent deed transfer. I turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life. I did not drive back to my quiet property in the woods. I steered the truck back toward the towering financial district. Stuart had given me the exact address of Apex Financial during our meeting. It was time to introduce myself to the people who were eagerly waiting to steal my land. The regional headquarters of Apex Financial occupied the top 3 floors of a massive steel and glass skyscraper. I parked my truck in the visitor lot and rode the silent elevator up to the executive level. The doors opened to reveal a cold, intimidating reception area designed to make borrowers feel small and powerless. The walls were paneled in dark walnut, and the floor was covered in thick charcoal carpet. A security guard in a tailored suit watched me closely as I walked toward the main reception desk. The receptionist looked at my faded flannel shirt and my scuffed boots with the exact same expression of distaste Melissa had used earlier. She asked if I was lost or looking for the service elevator. I placed both of my calloused hands flat on her pristine marble desk. I told her I was not lost. I instructed her to call the regional director of commercial lending immediately. I told her to inform him that the primary collateral listed on the $3 million bridge loan for Melissa Carter Interiors was entirely fraudulent. The receptionist froze. The condescending smirk vanished from her face. She picked up her phone and dialed an internal extension, her eyes locked nervously on my dirty work boots. Less than 2 minutes later, a tall man in a sharp gray suit hurried out of a set of double doors. He introduced himself as Richard, the regional director. He looked frantic and deeply concerned. He ushered me quickly past the security guard and into his private corner office, closing the heavy wooden door firmly behind us. He gestured for me to sit in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his massive mahogany desk. He did not offer me anything to drink or waste time with pleasantries. He sat down heavily and demanded to know exactly who I was and why I was making such massive accusations regarding one of their pending commercial accounts. I did not answer him immediately. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my worn leather wallet. I extracted my state-issued driver license and slid it across the smooth surface of his desk. Richard picked it up and read the name. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. He recognized my name as the primary property owner listed on the massive loan application his firm had just approved. I reached inside my jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope Stuart had prepared for me. I opened the flap and pulled out the original master deed to my 60-acre property. This was not a digital copy or a cheap reproduction. It was the original legally binding document stamped with the official seal of the state and certified by the Carter Holdings Blind Trust. I placed the heavy parchment directly next to my driver license. I told Richard to look very closely at the security clauses embedded in the second paragraph of the master deed. I explained that the property was locked inside an irrevocable blind trust and had been for the last 10 years. I stated clearly that the title was frozen, and absolutely no individual possessed the legal authority to use it as collateral for any financial transaction. Richard leaned forward, his face turning pale as he read the dense legal text. He was a man who understood financial liability perfectly. He realized in real time that his aggressive lending firm had just authorized a $3 million disbursement based entirely on a forged federal document. If that money was wired into Melissa's account tomorrow, his firm would suffer a massive unrecoverable loss and face severe federal scrutiny for failing to properly verify their collateral. Richard began to panic. He stammered frantically, reaching for his office phone to call his legal department and freeze the loan disbursement immediately. He claimed his firm was a victim of sophisticated identity theft. I reached across the desk and firmly placed my hand over his, holding the phone down. I told him he was not going to cancel the loan today. I told him we were going to let the process continue, exactly as Brian and Melissa expected. Richard looked at me as if I were insane. He asked why I would possibly want to allow a fraudulent loan to proceed when my own property was on the line. I removed my hand from the phone and reached back into my pocket. I pulled out the small digital voice recorder and set it on the desk. I pressed the play button. The clear audio of my son bragging about his flawless business plan and denying any use of stolen assets filled the quiet executive office. Richard listened in stunned silence as Brian aggressively insulted me and claimed complete ownership of his fake empire. I let the recording play to the very end before turning the device off. I looked the regional director dead in the eye. I explained that simply canceling the loan quietly would teach them absolutely nothing. They would just find another predatory lender or forge another document. I told Richard that Brian and Melissa were hosting a massive victory dinner on Friday night at a 5-star restaurant surrounded by their wealthy private equity investors. They were planning to celebrate the arrival of his bank's money. I instructed Richard to freeze their personal and business accounts at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, precisely 1 hour before their lavish dinner began. I told him to prepare a certified letter officially revoking the loan due to criminal fraud. I stated that my attorney and I would personally deliver that letter to their table. Richard stared at the original deed, the audio recorder, and my calloused hands. He realized he was not dealing with a confused old man, but with a meticulous architect of absolute ruin. He slowly nodded his head, agreeing to every single term. The trap was now fully armed and locked into place. Friday evening descended upon the city, casting long shadows across the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors of the most exclusive five-star restaurant in the state swung open to welcome the evening elite. This was an establishment that did not advertise its location and did not accept reservations from the general public. It was a fortress of culinary luxury, where the minimum cost of a dinner equated to a standard monthly mortgage payment. The air inside the main dining room was thick with the scent of white truffles, roasted bone marrow, and vintage red wine. Soft amber light filtered through imported crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, flattering glow over the faces of politicians, corporate executives, and high society socialites. The ambient noise was a gentle hum of polite conversation and the clinking of heavy sterling silver against fine porcelain. It was an atmosphere meticulously designed to project absolute power and unshakable financial stability. Deep inside the restaurant, tucked away behind a set of velvet curtains and thick, soundproof doors, lay the private executive dining suite. This secluded room was reserved for the most sensitive corporate negotiations and lavish celebrations. Tonight, it was occupied by Brian and Melissa. They had booked the room a week in advance, securing it with a massive deposit placed on a credit card that was already teetering on the absolute edge of its maximum limit. The long rectangular table dominating the center of the room was covered in crisp white linen and adorned with towering centerpieces of rare white orchids. 10 plush velvet chairs surrounded the table, each occupied by a person holding a heavy crystal glass. Brian and Melissa sat at the head of the table, acting as the grand orchestrators of this incredibly expensive illusion. Brian wore a brand new tailored tuxedo that fit him with razor-sharp precision. He had purchased it specifically for this evening, completely ignoring the fact that his bank accounts were entirely empty. He leaned back in his chair, projecting the relaxed, casual confidence of a man who commanded millions of dollars on a daily basis. He held a glass of dark red wine, swirling it gently, while he spoke to the men seated to his right. His face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of his perceived victory. He firmly believed that the $3 million commercial bridge loan from Apex Financial had been successfully wired into his business accounts just a few hours prior. He believed he had successfully stolen my 60-acre property, navigated the treacherous waters of commercial lending, and secured his extravagant future without a single complication. Melissa sat right beside him, radiating an aura of artificial perfection. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald silk gown and a diamond necklace that caught the ambient light with every slight movement of her head. She was fully in her element, playing the role of the highly successful, sophisticated visionary. She leaned across the table, engaging in animated conversation with the wives of the wealthy investors. She described the completely fabricated luxury hotel project in vivid, intricate detail. She spoke about importing rare Italian marble for the lobby and commissioning custom artwork for the penthouse suites. She lied with such incredible fluency and genuine enthusiasm that the women listening to her were entirely captivated. She showed absolutely no signs of the crushing anxiety that should accompany a woman facing multiple civil lawsuits for grand larceny. She was completely insulated by her own massive ego. The guests they were hosting were not fools. They were hardened private equity investors and aggressive venture capitalists. The lead investor, sitting directly to the left of Brian, was a man known for his ruthless business instincts and massive portfolio of commercial real estate. These men usually possessed an incredible ability to spot a bad investment from a mile away. However, Brian and Melissa had constructed a trap of social proof that was incredibly difficult to see through. The investors looked around the private dining suite, taking in the rare orchids, the vintage wine, and the undeniable physical evidence of massive wealth. They assumed that no one would dare host a dinner of this magnitude unless they were already wildly successful. The sheer audacity of the lie made it entirely believable. They listened to Brian's ambitious expansion plans and nodded in quiet approval, completely unaware they were sitting at a table funded by stolen client retainers and federal fraud. The waiters moved silently around the room like ghosts, anticipating every single need before it was even vocalized. They poured continuous streams of premium champagne and served courses of caviar resting on small mother-of-pearl spoons. Every time a waiter presented a new bottle of wine or a decadent appetizer, the invisible final bill grew exponentially larger. Brian waved his hand dismissively whenever the head waiter asked if they should pace the courses. Brian instructed him to bring out the most expensive items on the menu, declaring that tonight was a night for absolute celebration. He was throwing stolen money into a roaring fire, completely blind to the fact that the flames were about to consume him entirely. The profound irony of the situation hung heavily in the air, completely undetected by anyone in the room. Brian and Melissa were sitting at the peak of their fabricated mountain, enjoying the finest food in the city, while holding the attention of the most powerful financial figures in the state. They felt utterly untouchable. Yet the financial ground beneath their feet had already been completely removed. At exactly 5 o'clock that afternoon, while Brian was standing in front of his bathroom mirror, tying his silk bow tie, the regional director of Apex Financial had executed the trap. A secure digital command had been sent through the banking network, instantly freezing every single personal and business account attached to their social security numbers. Their credit cards were canceled. Their lines of credit were permanently revoked. The stolen retainers and the massive debts were officially locked down by federal fraud investigators. They were currently sitting in a 5-star restaurant, consuming thousands of dollars worth of premium goods, with absolutely zero means of paying the bill. They were entirely bankrupt, penniless, and facing severe federal criminal charges. But in this specific moment, isolated inside the warm, glowing luxury of the private dining room, they knew none of this. They were completely shielded from the devastating reality waiting just outside the velvet curtains. The main course arrived. The waiters placed heavy porcelain plates in front of the guests, featuring perfectly seared Wagyu beef and delicate truffle purees. The smell of the rich food filled the room, elevating the mood to its absolute peak. Brian stood up from his chair and picked up his crystal champagne flute. He tapped the side of the glass with a silver fork, producing a sharp ringing sound that immediately quieted the room. The private equity investors stopped eating and looked up at him with polite interest. Melissa smiled up at her husband, her eyes shining with absolute triumph. Brian raised his glass high into the air. He cleared his throat and began to speak. He thanked the powerful men for taking the time to join him on this momentous occasion. He spoke about the value of bold vision and the courage required to take massive risks in the modern business world. He looked directly at the lead investor and declared that this dinner marked the beginning of a highly lucrative and completely unstoppable partnership. He boasted that his design firm was about to change the entire landscape of the city. He invited everyone to raise their glasses and drink to their guaranteed mutual success. The investors smiled and raised their flutes, echoing his arrogant cheer. The sound of crystal clinking together filled the opulent room, marking the exact final second of their grand illusion. The stage was perfectly set. The absolute height of their hubris had been reached, and I was standing just on the other side of the heavy mahogany doors, waiting to tear it all down. I stood on the cold concrete sidewalk outside the restaurant, waiting in the biting night air. I watched a line of luxury vehicles pull up to the valet stand. Men in expensive wool coats and women in designer silk gowns stepped out laughing softly as they were ushered through the heavy front doors. I did not move to join them. I waited by the corner of the brick building until a dark blue sedan pulled up to the curb. Stewart stepped out of the passenger side. He was wearing his standard charcoal gray suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. 2 men stepped out of the back doors. They were not dressed for a high society dinner. They wore dark, generic suits and sensible shoes. Their posture was rigid and entirely alert. They were federal fraud investigators. Stewart introduced them briefly as Agent Reynolds and Agent Foster. We did not shake hands. This was not a social gathering. It was a highly calculated tactical operation. We approached the main entrance together. The restaurant employee stood behind a polished mahogany podium. He looked up and immediately raised a hand to stop us. He opened his mouth to inform me that I did not meet the strict dress code and that the restaurant was completely booked. Before he could utter a single syllable, Agent Reynolds flipped open a small leather wallet. A heavy silver shield caught the amber light of the foyer. Reynolds calmly instructed the man to step aside and point us toward the private executive suite. The color drained from the restaurant employee's face completely. He nodded silently and gestured down a long, softly lit hallway. We walked through the main dining room. The synchronized sound of our footsteps cut sharply through the gentle hum of polite conversation. The wealthy patrons stopped eating and stared in pure confusion. They saw an old man in a faded green flannel shirt and scuffed work boots, leading a highly recognizable corporate attorney and two obvious federal agents through their exclusive sanctuary. The ambient noise of the restaurant died down, creating a wake of heavy, suffocating silence behind us. I did not look left or right. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the set of thick velvet curtains at the very end of the corridor. We reached the heavy soundproof doors of the private suite. I could hear the muffled sound of my son's voice through the thick wood. He was delivering his arrogant toast to his wealthy guests. I waited for exactly 5 seconds. I listened closely for the sharp sound of crystal glasses clinking together. The moment I heard the fragile glass ring out celebrating his massive fraud, I placed my calloused hand on the solid brass door handle. I pushed the door open wide without knocking. The transition was violent. The warm, joyous atmosphere inside the room collided instantly with the cold, undeniable reality we brought with us. I stepped into the private suite. Stewart followed directly behind me, and the two federal agents flanked the doorway, physically blocking the only exit from the room. Brian was standing at the head of the long table. His crystal champagne flute was still raised high in the air. A confident, arrogant smile was frozen on his face. He looked toward the opening door, expecting a waiter bringing another round of expensive vintage wine to his wealthy investors. Instead, he saw me. He saw the old man he had specifically banned from his son's graduation party. He saw the father he was actively trying to leave homeless through a forged property deed. The arrogant smile on his face cracked and fell away like cheap, broken plaster. His eyes darted nervously from my faded flannel shirt to the sharp professional suits of the federal agents. His brain struggled desperately to comprehend how his two completely separate worlds had just violently merged into one room. Melissa was sitting right beside him. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth, holding a small pearl spoon filled with expensive caviar. The artificial, glowing pride left her face entirely and was quickly replaced by a mask of absolute stark terror. She recognized the severe, uncompromising look of law enforcement immediately. She knew exactly what she had done with the stolen client money, and she knew the final bill had finally arrived. The private equity investors seated around the table were deeply confused. The lead investor sitting to the left of Brian slowly lowered his glass to the table. He looked at me and then looked directly at Brian, waiting for a logical explanation. He assumed I was an angry, disgruntled employee, or perhaps a confused old relative who had somehow managed to slip past the security desk. Brian opened his mouth to speak. He tried to summon his authoritative corporate voice to demand that the restaurant security remove us from his private dinner, but his throat was completely dry. No words came out. He simply gasped for air. The shift in power in the room was instantaneous and absolute. He was no longer the master of his fake, affluent universe. He was a cornered animal completely stripped of his elaborate defenses. I began walking slowly down the length of the long rectangular table. I did not acknowledge the wealthy investors or their expensive suits. I did not look at the towering white floral arrangements or the decadent food resting on the fine china plates. I kept my gaze locked entirely on my son. The heavy rubber tread of my work boots squeaked and echoed loudly against the hardwood floor in the completely silent room. Every single step I took dismantled another piece of his carefully constructed illusion of wealth. I reached the head of the table and stopped directly next to his chair, looking down at him. Stuart stepped forward and broke the heavy silence. His voice was loud, clear, and carried the undeniable, crushing weight of supreme legal authority. He introduced himself to the entire room as the senior managing partner of his corporate law firm. He gestured to the two stoic men standing by the closed wooden door and introduced them as active senior investigators for the Federal Financial Fraud Division. A collective gasp rippled rapidly through the seated investors. The lead investor immediately pushed his heavy wooden chair back away from the table, putting significant physical distance between himself and Brian. These men survived and thrived in the financial world by strictly avoiding all legal liabilities. The mere mention of a federal fraud investigation was a highly contagious financial disease they wanted absolutely nothing to do with. The lead investor reached for his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, preparing to completely abandon the fraudulent deal. I reached into the inside pocket of my faded green jacket. I pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. It bore the official embossed gold seal of the Carter Holdings Legal Trust. I held it in my calloused hand, feeling the heavy weight of the undeniable truth contained inside its pages. I did not politely hand it to Brian. I did not offer it to him to read privately in the hallway. I reached across the table and dropped the heavy envelope directly onto his pristine porcelain dinner plate. The envelope landed squarely on top of his incredibly expensive seared Wagyu beef, soaking up the rich, dark brown sauce. Melissa dropped her pearl spoon. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. She stared at the white envelope as if it were a venomous snake resting on the table. She looked at the federal agents standing by the door and began to shake uncontrollably. The lead investor did not even wait for Brian to attempt an explanation. He stood up completely disgusted by the massive legal liability sitting next to him. He advised the other men at the table to leave the room immediately. I looked down at my son while he sat trembling in his brand-new tailored tuxedo. I spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm, steady, and carried the force of an absolute final judgment. I told him that the $3 million commercial bridge loan he had celebrated tonight was permanently canceled. I informed the entire room of silent, staring investors that the collateral used to secure the massive funding was a piece of private real estate he did not actually own. I stated clearly, and without any hesitation, that he had forged his own father's signature to steal a protected legal asset from a sealed trust. I leaned closer, resting my heavy hands firmly on the top back edge of his chair. I told him that the bank accounts he was desperately relying on to pay for this extravagant 5-star dinner had been completely frozen by a federal court order over 2 hours ago. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated panic as the full, devastating reality of his situation finally crushed him. The fake empire he had spent years building through lies and stolen money had just collapsed into dust right in front of his most important professional audience. I stood up straight, adjusting the collar of my worn flannel shirt. The truth was now permanently exposed, and the consequences were absolutely inescapable. The white envelope sat completely still on the ruined porcelain plate. The rich brown sauce from the Wagyu beef slowly seeped into the thick paper edge, but the embossed gold seal of Carter Holdings remained pristine and completely untouched. The heavy silence in the private dining room was no longer just uncomfortable. It was a suffocating physical weight, pressing down on every single person sitting at the long table. Brian stared at the envelope with his mouth slightly open, unable to form a single coherent word. His face had turned the color of cold ash. The arrogant, powerful corporate executive who had just commanded the attention of the room was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified little boy who had just been caught committing a massive, unforgivable crime. Melissa was paralyzed beside him. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. She looked wildly between the federal agents standing at the door and the grim, uncompromising face of my attorney. She knew there was no lie sophisticated enough to save them from this exact moment. The lead investor broke the paralyzing spell. He was a man who managed billions of dollars in corporate assets, and he did not tolerate mysteries or hidden liabilities in his business dealings. He reached across the white linen tablecloth, his expensive suit sleeve brushing against the crystal champagne flutes. He ignored Brian completely and grabbed the heavy envelope right off the dinner plate. Brian twitched a pathetic, half-formed motion to stop him, but the investor shot him a look of such absolute icy authority that Brian instantly froze in his chair. The investor tore open the heavy paper flap with a single sharp motion. He pulled out the certified letter of fraudulent collateral and the supporting legal documentation my attorney had prepared specifically for this evening. He put on his wire-framed reading glasses and began to scan the dense paragraphs. The entire room watched him in absolute silence. We watched the precise moment his calculating mind processed the severity of the situation. His jaw tightened into a rigid, sharp line. His eyes darted across the page, reading the details of the forged signature, the stolen property deed, and the federal bank freeze. He was reading the absolute destruction of his own pending multi-million-dollar partnership in real time. The lead investor finished reading the final page. He slowly took off his glasses and folded them, placing them carefully into his breast pocket. He placed the certified letter flat on the table for everyone to see. He looked at Brian with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not yell or raise his voice. Men of his immense caliber do not need to yell to completely destroy a person. He spoke in a low, dangerously calm voice that carried to every single corner of the private suite. He stated that in his 30 years of managing private equity, he had dealt with bad investments, failed startups, and incompetent executives. But he said he had never encountered a man stupid enough to forge a federal banking document and then invite federal investigators to his own lavish victory dinner. He turned to the other wealthy men seated around the long table. He informed them with absolute clarity that the interior design firm they were about to fund was entirely bankrupt and operating solely on stolen client money. He told them the collateral securing the loans was completely fraudulent, and that any man who stayed in this room for one more minute risked becoming an accessory to a massive federal financial crime. The reaction was immediate and entirely chaotic. The powerful men around the table did not ask for further proof or debate the legal nuances. The presence of the federal agents and the official documentation from a senior corporate attorney were more than enough to trigger their fierce survival instincts. They stood up in complete unison, pushing their heavy velvet chairs back so violently that several of them tipped over and crashed loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The wives of the investors who had been listening to Melissa brag about imported Italian marble just moments ago now looked at her with expressions of absolute horror and revulsion. They grabbed their expensive designer handbags and rushed away from the table, treating Melissa like a highly infectious disease. Melissa tried to speak. She tried to force a confident laugh and claim this was all a massive misunderstanding, a terrible administrative legal mix-up. But her voice cracked and faded into a pathetic whimper as one of the wealthy wives actively physically recoiled from her extended hand. The social destruction was instantaneous and completely irreversible. Melissa was no longer a sophisticated high society visionary. She was a publicly exposed common thief watching her entire fake life crumble into dust. Brian finally found his voice, but it was entirely the wrong one. He scrambled out of his chair, knocking over his crystal champagne flute. The expensive vintage wine spilled across the white linen tablecloth, looking exactly like fresh, dark blood spreading over snow. He chased after the lead investor, reaching out with trembling, desperate hands to grab the sleeve of the older man's suit jacket. He begged him to wait right there in the middle of the room. He pleaded with him to listen to reason, claiming he could fix the paperwork and secure entirely different funding by Monday morning. He promised the luxury hotel project was still completely viable. It was the most pathetic display of desperation I had ever witnessed in my entire life. The lead investor violently yanked his arm away from Brian's sweaty grasp. He turned around and pointed a rigid, commanding finger directly at Brian's pale face. He told Brian that he was completely blacklisted from every single financial institution in the entire state. He promised that he would personally ensure no legitimate investor ever took a phone call or a meeting from him ever again. He told Brian that his professional life was permanently over and that he should spend his remaining time finding a very good criminal defense attorney before he ended up in a federal penitentiary. The wealthy guests flooded toward the exit, desperate to escape the toxic criminal atmosphere of the private dining suite. The two federal agents stepped aside just enough to let the fleeing investors pass safely into the hallway, while ensuring Brian and Melissa remained trapped inside the room. Within 60 seconds, the luxurious executive suite was completely empty of its high society audience. The grand, elaborate celebration had been entirely hollowed out. Only the miserable wreckage remained. Overturned velvet chairs, spilled wine, discarded cloth napkins, and half-eaten plates of incredibly expensive food littered the beautiful room. The silence that fell over the suite now was the silence of a graveyard. Brian stood entirely alone in the center of the room, his brand-new tailored tuxedo looking absurd and completely out of place on a man whose entire life had just been legally and socially shattered. He looked around at the empty chairs and the ruined dinner table. He realized that every single thing he had valued, his professional reputation, his wealthy connections, his perceived social power, had evaporated into thin air. He had traded his own loyal father for a seat at a table that no longer existed. He slowly sank down onto his knees on the polished hardwood floor right in front of the spilled champagne. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. It was not a quiet, dignified crying. It was the loud, agonizing wail of a man experiencing the total, absolute collapse of his reality in real time. I stood at the head of the ruined table observing the absolute devastation I had orchestrated. The silent correction was severe, but it was perfectly just. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining suite remained slightly open after the last wealthy investor fled the room. The absolute silence inside the luxurious space was broken only by the pathetic sound of Brian sobbing on the polished hardwood floor. He remained on his knees, surrounded by the spilled vintage champagne and the overturned velvet chairs. Melissa sat frozen at the ruined table, staring blankly at the embossed gold seal on the certified letter that had just destroyed her entire life. I stood near the entrance with Stuart and the two federal agents, observing the complete collapse of my son's fabricated empire. We did not speak. There was absolutely nothing left to say. The legal trap had been sprung, and the structural damage was permanent. Then the heavy doors opened completely. The head waiter stepped into the room carrying a sleek black leather folio. He stopped abruptly, taking in the bizarre and chaotic scene in front of him. He saw the empty chairs, the ruined food, and the weeping man on the floor. He saw the federal agents standing guard by the exit. The highly trained restaurant staff usually ignored the personal dramas of their wealthy clients, but this level of devastation was unprecedented. However, the waiter had a specific job to perform. The private equity investors had ordered thousands of dollars worth of premium caviar, imported Wagyu beef, and rare vintage wines before they evacuated the premises. The restaurant required immediate compensation for the consumed goods. The waiter composed himself carefully, stepped around a pool of spilled red wine, and approached the head of the table. He placed the black leather folio gently onto the white linen tablecloth right next to the certified letter of fraud. He announced in a perfectly neutral voice that the total bill for the evening was exactly $3,400. Brian did not even lift his head from his hands. The concept of a restaurant bill was entirely meaningless to a man who was about to face decades in a federal penitentiary. But Melissa possessed a different kind of desperation. She was entirely driven by the need to maintain appearances. She could not process the massive federal crimes or the impending prison sentences. Her brain desperately latched onto the immediate physical problem in front of her. She believed that if she could just pay this bill, she could somehow regain a tiny fraction of her shattered dignity. She forced herself to sit up straight, smoothing the fabric of her expensive emerald silk gown with shaking hands. She reached for her designer handbag resting on the floor beside her chair. She pulled out a thick, heavy platinum credit card. It was the primary card tied to her interior design business, the very account she had used to funnel stolen client retainers to fund her luxurious lifestyle. She held the metal card between her perfectly manicured fingers, holding it up toward the waiter with a forced, trembling smile. She ordered him to run the card and bring her the receipt immediately. She completely ignored my presence and the presence of the federal investigators. She was desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy, sophisticated woman who was simply dealing with a minor social inconvenience. The waiter took the heavy metal card, nodded politely, and walked out of the private suite to process the transaction at the main terminal. The waiting period that followed was excruciating. I watched Melissa tap her long fingernails against the edge of the ruined table. Her eyes darted nervously toward the open door. She was clinging to the desperate hope that the federal freeze I had announced was simply a bluff or a legal threat that had not yet taken effect. She firmly believed her platinum status would somehow override a federal mandate. I knew exactly what was happening at the main terminal. I knew the digital systems were communicating with the frozen banking servers and generating a hard, undeniable rejection. The heavy silence in the room amplified the sound of Brian's ragged breathing as he remained curled on the floor, completely broken by his own hubris. Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy doors swung open again. The head waiter returned, but he was not alone. He was accompanied by the general manager of the five-star restaurant. The manager was a tall, imposing man, wearing a severe black suit. His expression was entirely devoid of the polite deference usually reserved for their wealthy clientele. He walked directly to the head of the table and placed the black leather folio back onto the white linen. He opened it slowly. Resting inside was Melissa's heavy platinum card, sitting right next to a long red receipt printed with the words, "Transaction declined due to account freeze." The manager looked down at Melissa and stated in a cold, uncompromising tone that her primary banking institution had completely rejected the charge. He informed her that the terminal had displayed a rare code indicating a total asset lockdown. Melissa stared at the red slip of paper as if it were written in a foreign language. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. She began frantically digging through her designer handbag, pulling out a handful of different credit cards. She produced a gold rewards card, a corporate expense card, and a premium travel card. She threw them onto the table in a desperate, chaotic pile, demanding the manager try every single one of them. She claimed there was simply a glitch in the banking system, and that she possessed massive reserves of corporate capital. The manager did not touch the pile of cards. He looked at the two federal agents standing near the doorway, and then looked back down at the terrified woman. He stated that he had already taken the liberty of calling her banking institution directly when the first terminal alert appeared. He informed her that the fraud department at her bank had explicitly instructed him to confiscate all cards bearing her name. He reached out and swept the entire pile of plastic and metal cards into his hand, dropping them into his suit pocket. Melissa let out a short, high-pitched gasp. The final shred of her fake reality was completely gone. She was sitting in a luxury dress surrounded by ruined extravagance, completely and utterly penniless. The manager did not offer any sympathy. He leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the edge of the table. He told her that the restaurant had provided $3,400 worth of elite services and consumed goods. He stated that failing to pay for these services constituted criminal theft. He demanded an alternative form of immediate cash payment, or he would instruct his security team to contact the local police department and press formal charges before they even left the building. Brian finally looked up from the floor. His face was stained with tears, and his expensive tuxedo was ruined with spilled wine and floor wax. He looked at his wife, realizing that they did not possess a single dollar between them. They could not even afford a taxi ride home. The massive $3 million bridge loan they had celebrated was gone. The business accounts were gone. The stolen client money was gone. They were entirely bankrupt in the most public, humiliating way possible. The threat of immediate local police action for a restaurant bill piled directly on top of the impending federal indictment was the final crushing blow to his shattered psyche. I stood in silence, watching the manager enforce the absolute bottom of their downward spiral. I had promised my son that the taste of victory becomes incredibly bitter when the actual bill finally arrives. He was now choking on that exact bitterness. I did not offer to pay the bill for them. I did not reach for my own wallet to save them from this final indignity. I let them sit in the absolute squalor of their own making. The federal agents stepped forward slightly, preparing to officially intervene and begin the formal process of their federal arrests. The grand illusion was dead. The silent correction was absolutely complete. Exactly 7 days had passed since the silent executive suite of the five-star restaurant. The weather matched the grim reality of my son's new existence. A relentless cold rain hammered against the tin roof of my woodworking shop. I was standing inside, running a soft cloth over the polished surface of the mahogany desk I had built for my grandson. The local news over the past week had been filled with the spectacular collapse of Melissa Carter Interiors. It had not been a quiet, professional failure. It was a highly public corporate slaughter. The private equity investors had made absolutely sure that everyone in the financial district knew about the forged collateral and the stolen client retainers. Stewart had kept me updated on the rapid legal and financial consequences. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed. On Monday morning, the commercial landlord of the downtown design studio had locked the doors and placed an eviction notice on the pristine glass. By Wednesday, the leasing company arrived at their suburban home with flatbed tow trucks. They hitched chains to both of their luxury vehicles and dragged them out of the driveway while the entire neighborhood watched from their windows. On Friday, the primary mortgage lender officially filed for immediate foreclosure on their massive house, citing the federal fraud investigation as a catastrophic breach of contract. Their credit was destroyed, their bank accounts remained frozen, and the civil lawsuits from the defrauded clients were piling up rapidly. The empire built on my forged signature had completely dissolved in exactly 168 hours. I heard the heavy sound of tires crunching against the wet gravel of my long driveway. I did not expect any deliveries. I walked to the window of my workshop and looked out through the driving rain. A battered yellow taxicab was idling on the other side of the heavy iron security gates, marking the entrance to my property. The gates were securely locked. I watched the passenger side doors open. Brian and Melissa stepped out into the freezing downpour. The taxi immediately threw itself into reverse, turning around and speeding away down the rural road, leaving them entirely stranded. I walked out of the workshop and stood under the deep overhang of the porch, watching them approach the iron bars. The physical transformation was staggering. They looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, sophisticated couple who had sipped vintage champagne just a week ago. Brian was wearing a wrinkled gray hooded sweatshirt that was rapidly soaking through, sticking flat against his shoulders. He looked exhausted. Dark purple bags hung heavily under his eyes, and he had not shaved in days. He was trembling violently in the cold rain. Melissa was completely unrecognizable. She was not wearing imported silk or heavy gold bracelets. She wore a cheap plastic rain slicker. Her hair was plastered flat against her skull, and the flawless makeup she usually wore to project absolute power was entirely gone, revealing the pale, terrified face of a woman who had finally hit rock bottom. I zipped up my heavy canvas work jacket and stepped out into the rain, walking slowly down the gravel driveway. I did not rush. I let them stand there, gripping the wet iron bars, feeling the bitter cold. I reached the gate and stopped, remaining on my side of the iron barrier. I did not unlock it. I did not invite them inside out of the storm. I simply looked at them. Brian gripped the metal bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. He did not issue any arrogant commands or demand respect. He opened his mouth, and the very first sound that came out was a pathetic, broken sob. He pressed his face against the wet iron. He begged me to open the gate. He pleaded for just 10 minutes of my time, claiming they had absolutely nowhere else to go. He said the federal prosecutors were threatening them with 20 years in a maximum security prison unless they could produce the millions of dollars they had stolen from the design clients. He cried that all of their wealthy friends had completely abandoned them. The people they had so desperately tried to impress at the graduation party, the people they had deemed special enough to attend while excluding me, had blocked their phone numbers and locked their doors. They were entirely toxic. Melissa pushed her way to the front, crowding the space next to Brian. The woman who had laughed at my work boots and offered me a $50 gift card was now openly weeping. She pushed her hands through the gaps in the iron bars, reaching out toward me in a desperate, grasping motion. She begged me to forgive her. She claimed she had been incredibly foolish and blinded by the pressure of running a high-profile business. She cried that she never meant to hurt me, and that she always respected my simple, honest life. The lie was so transparent it was almost physically sickening. She did not respect my life. She only respected the massive fortune sitting in the blind trust she had recently discovered during the federal investigation. Brian interrupted her, his voice cracking loudly over the sound of the falling rain. He brought up the blind trust. He told me he knew about the massive fortune Stuart was managing. He completely dropped any pretense of wanting to repair our relationship and went straight for the money. He begged me to authorize a release of funds. He claimed that $3 million was nothing to me, just a tiny fraction of my total wealth. He swore on his life that if I just paid off the defrauded clients and hired an elite criminal defense team to make the federal charges disappear, he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He promised to visit me every single week. He promised to be the perfect devoted son. He was trying to sell me the exact same fake loyalty he had used to steal my land. They stood in the freezing mud, pouring out a torrent of desperate promises and pathetic apologies. They offered to clean my workshop. They offered to cook my meals. They offered to humiliate themselves in any way I required if I would just sign a check and save them from the terrifying reality of federal prison. The sheer volume of their begging echoed against the surrounding trees. They firmly believed that because I was an older man, because I was a father, I possessed an infinite reservoir of unconditional weakness they could exploit. They thought the biological tie between us would eventually force me to capitulate. They assumed the sight of them shivering and crying in the rain would break my resolve and wipe away the fact that they had meticulously forged my signature to leave me homeless. I stood in the rain, completely unmoved. I did not feel a single drop of pity. The people standing on the other side of the gate were not my family. They were ruthless financial predators who had simply run out of victims. The tears running down their faces were not tears of genuine remorse. They were not crying because they regretted their terrible actions or because they felt guilty for betraying me. They were crying entirely because they had been caught. They were crying because the consequences of their massive fraud had finally arrived, and they lacked the strength to face them. I watched the cold rain wash the remaining traces of their fake elite lives into the mud at their feet. I let them beg until their voices grew hoarse and their desperate promises faded into exhausted, pathetic whimpers. I listened to the entire performance, and then I prepared to deliver my final verdict. The freezing rain continued to beat relentlessly against the thick iron bars of the heavy security gate. I stood motionless under the downpour and waited until my son and his wife had completely exhausted their vocal cords. Their desperate whimpers and pathetic apologies slowly faded into the loud ambient noise of the storm. They stared at me through the wet metal bars with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the unconditional, paternal rescue they had always taken for granted. I looked at Brian standing knee-deep in the freezing mud, wearing a soaked, hooded sweatshirt that clung tightly to his shaking frame. I looked at Melissa shivering violently beside him, wrapped in a cheap, transparent plastic rain slicker that offered absolutely no protection from the biting cold. I observed their complete physical and social degradation. I did not feel a single ounce of the parental guilt they were trying so desperately to weaponize against me. My paternal instinct had died the exact moment I saw my forged signature on that fraudulent deed. I took a slow, deliberate breath of the cold, wet air. I finally broke my long silence. I spoke in a voice that was completely flat, stoic, and entirely devoid of any emotional warmth. I told them that their theatrical performance was incredibly impressive. I told them they possessed a remarkable, profound talent for playing the helpless victim, right after completely destroying their own lives. I addressed Brian first. I looked directly into his bloodshot, panicked eyes. I told him that I had listened very closely to his pathetic apologies and his grand, desperate promises of future loyalty. I told him that he was speaking to me right now as if he had simply made a minor bad business investment or a foolish, youthful mistake. I forcefully and coldly corrected his massive delusion. I reminded him that he did not make a mistake. He executed a highly calculated, deeply malicious, and perfectly planned federal financial crime. I described the exact psychological process required to forge my signature on a government document. I told him I knew he had spent countless hours sitting at his expensive mahogany desk practicing the exact loops and sharp angles of my handwriting. He had studied my personal identity specifically so he could completely erase my financial existence. He had walked into a title loan office and willingly signed away the 60 acres of pristine land I had spent my entire adult life working grueling hours to secure. He had actively and consciously chosen to leave his own father completely homeless just to cover up the massive criminal debts his wife had accumulated. I told him that a man who is capable of that level of profound, calculated betrayal does not possess a soul worth saving. Then I turned my absolute attention to Melissa. She flinched physically under my cold, unyielding gaze. I reminded her of the phone call from exactly 2 weeks ago. I reminded her of the sharp, condescending laugh she had let out when she informed me I was not wealthy or special enough to attend my own grandson's college graduation celebration. I reminded her of the exact moment she stood inside her completely bankrupt design studio, surrounded by stolen luxury furniture, and proudly handed me a $50 gift card to a cheap roadside diner. I told her that she had built her entire fake identity on looking down at honest working-class people like me. She had spent a decade actively mocking my calloused hands, my faded green flannel shirts, and my old rusted pickup truck. I told her it was deeply poetic and perfectly just that she was now standing in the freezing mud, begging for a massive financial handout from the exact same man she had treated like absolute garbage. I told her that her tears and her fake apologies meant absolutely nothing to me, because they were born entirely out of raw financial terror and not a single shred of genuine human remorse. Brian gripped the wet iron bars even tighter, shaking them weakly in a final desperate attempt to interrupt my verdict. He cried out about the blind trust again, begging me to just sign a single piece of papers to release the $3 million they needed. He claimed it was my fundamental duty as a father to protect my only son from the horrors of a federal penitentiary. I stepped right up to the iron gate until my face was only inches away from his. I told him the absolute, undeniable truth about the Carter Holdings Master Trust. I explained that I had built that financial fortress 10 years ago specifically to protect him from his own greed. I had seen the early warning signs of his deep entitlement and his toxic obsession with fake wealth. I hid my $40 million because I wanted to force him to build a legitimate, meaningful life with his own 2 hands. I wanted him to learn the true value of honest labor and personal integrity. I told him that opening the trust now and paying off his massive criminal debts would completely destroy the entire core purpose of my life's work. I stated with absolute uncompromising finality that I would rather watch every single dollar in that massive account burn to ash than hand a single penny over to a thief who forged my legal name. I proceeded to break down the exact terrifying reality of their impending future. I told them I was not actively punishing them or seeking cruel revenge. I was simply refusing to interfere with the natural, devastating consequences of their own horrific choices. I explained that the federal prosecutors were going to tear their entire lives apart, and I was not going to hire a single lawyer or spend a single dollar to defend them. I told them the civil courts were going to strip them of every single asset they had ever falsely claimed to own. They were going to permanently lose the massive suburban house, the luxury imported cars, and the remaining pathetic shreds of their fake high society reputation. I told Brian that he was going to stand in a cold federal courtroom and confess to his massive financial crimes, and he was going to do it completely alone. I told him that when the federal judge handed down his lengthy prison sentence, he would finally have to take personal responsibility for the very first time in his entire pathetic existence. The freezing rain began to fall even harder, washing the remaining loose gravel down the steep slope of the driveway. I took a deliberate physical step back from the heavy iron gate. I told them that our relationship was officially and permanently severed. I explained that a true family is not simply a biological accident or a shared last name. A real family requires mutual respect, basic honesty, and a solid foundation of unconditional trust. They had completely eradicated every single one of those vital elements. I told Brian that he was no longer my son. He was simply a desperate, terrified criminal who had attempted to rob an old man. I told Melissa she was no longer my daughter-in-law. She was just a common fraud, completely terrified of the justice system she could no longer buy her way out of. I established a rigid, impenetrable boundary right there in the freezing rain. I told them that my 60-acre property was a peaceful sanctuary reserved only for honest, hard-working people, and they no longer qualified for entry. Brian fell to his knees in the thick mud, still gripping the iron bars, crying out my name in a high-pitched, agonizing wail. Melissa collapsed right beside him, sobbing uncontrollably into her wet, shaking hands. I did not look away or show any signs of weakness. I watched them break completely under the crushing weight of their own actions. I raised my right hand and pointed a single calloused finger down the long, empty rural road behind them. I delivered my final, uncompromising order. I commanded them to turn around, walk away from my security gates, and never return to my property for the rest of their natural lives. I told them that if they ever attempted to contact me again, if they ever sent a single letter, made a phone call, or showed up at my border, I would immediately have the local authorities arrest them for criminal trespassing and targeted harassment. I stated clearly that my absolute silence was the only gift they were ever going to receive from me again. I turned my back on them without another word. I walked slowly and steadily up the gravel driveway, heading back toward my warm, dry woodworking shop. I heard their desperate screams echoing through the trees behind me, begging me to come back, begging for a mercy they absolutely did not deserve. I did not break my stride or look over my shoulder. I walked inside my shop, closed the heavy solid wooden door, and locked the deadbolt firmly into place, sealing them outside in the cold, dark storm forever. The heavy storm that washed my son away finally broke just before dawn. The morning sun rose over the tree line, casting a bright, clean light across my 60-acre property. The air smelled of wet pine needles and damp earth. I spent the early hours of the morning sweeping the dead leaves off the front porch and organizing the heavy steel tools inside my woodworking shop. The profound silence of the rural landscape felt completely different today. It was no longer heavy with the suffocating anticipation of a conflict. It was the deep, absolute peace that only follows a necessary destruction. I was standing at my workbench, running my calloused hand over the smooth mahogany wood, when I heard the distinct sound of a vehicle engine turning off the main paved road and crunching onto my gravel driveway. I did not expect any visitors. I wiped my hands on a clean cotton rag and walked out of the shop, stepping into the cool morning air. I looked down the long slope of the driveway toward the heavy iron security gates. A bright yellow city taxi was parked right outside the barrier. The bright artificial color looked completely out of place against the backdrop of the deep green forest. I watched the driver pop the rear trunk. The passenger door opened, and a tall young man stepped out onto the wet gravel. It was my grandson Cameron. He was not wearing the expensive designer clothes his mother had always forced him to wear for their high society photographs. He was wearing a simple faded canvas jacket, heavy denim jeans, and a pair of sturdy leather work boots. Cameron walked to the back of the taxi and pulled out two large, heavy canvas duffel bags. He did not look angry or panicked. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He paid the driver through the open window and stepped back. The yellow taxi executed a sharp turn and drove away down the rural road, leaving Cameron standing entirely alone outside my locked gates. He did not shout my name or rattle the iron bars the way his father had done just yesterday. He simply picked up his heavy bags, walked up to the gate, and waited patiently. He knew I was there. He respected the boundary I had established, and he possessed the dignity to wait for my permission to approach. I zipped up my heavy canvas jacket and began the long walk down the gravel driveway. Every step I took brought the sharp reality of the situation into focus. My son had raised this boy in a house completely built on massive lies and stolen money. Cameron had grown up surrounded by the toxic illusion of immense wealth and social superiority. I had kept my distance for years, specifically, to avoid the suffocating arrogance of his parents. I did not know what kind of man the boy had truly become. I reached the iron gate and stopped. I looked at Cameron through the thick metal bars. He looked exhausted. The physical toll of the last week was clearly visible on his face, but his eyes were completely clear and steady. Cameron set his heavy bags down in the wet gravel. He looked me directly in the eyes and did not offer a polite, meaningless greeting. He started speaking with a calm, measured voice. He told me he had packed everything he owned and walked out of his parents' house 3 days ago. He said he had absolutely no idea about the massive commercial bridge loan, the forged property deed, or the stolen client retainers, until the federal investigators showed up at their front door with a search warrant. He described the absolute chaos of the last week. He watched his mother scream at the bank officials and watched his father completely fall apart, blaming everyone else in the world for his own criminal actions. Cameron took a deep breath and addressed the deepest betrayal first. He brought up the graduation party at the exclusive country club. He told me he had begged his parents to invite me. He wanted his grandfather there to see him celebrate his architectural degree. His parents had flatly refused, claiming I was too busy with my rural life to attend. Cameron told me he spent the entire party sitting in a corner, watching his parents hand out business cards and pitch fake hotel projects to wealthy private equity investors. He realized that night that the party was never about celebrating his hard work. It was a calculated networking event, and he was nothing more than a convenient prop used to secure their fraudulent commercial loans. He told me that when the truth finally came out, when he saw the foreclosure notices, and realized his entire life had been funded by stolen client money, he felt a profound, sickening disgust. His father had actually demanded that Cameron help them hide their remaining valuable assets from the federal authorities. Brian wanted his own son to become an active accomplice to his massive financial fraud. Cameron looked at me through the iron bars and said he refused completely. He told his parents that he would rather sleep on the cold city streets than spend one more second living inside their criminal illusion. He packed his canvas bags, called a taxi, and walked away from the toxic wreckage of their lives, completely turning his back on their fake high society world. Cameron did not ask me for money to pay off his massive student loans. He did not ask for access to a trust fund or a comfortable monthly allowance. He pointed toward the thick woods and my large woodworking shop. He told me he had a university degree in architecture, but he realized he knew absolutely nothing about how things were actually built in the real world. He said he wanted to learn how to construct a solid foundation. He wanted to learn how to work with his hands, how to measure twice and cut once, and how to live a life that was completely honest and real. He asked me if I needed a full-time apprentice. He asked if he could stay in the small spare room above the garage and work for his daily keep. I stood completely silent, processing his words. The stark contrast between my son and my grandson was absolutely staggering. Brian had stood in this exact same spot yesterday, crying in the freezing mud, begging me to rescue him from the legal consequences of his own terrible choices. Brian wanted unearned wealth and a total escape from personal responsibility. Cameron was standing here today, standing tall and composed, asking only for an opportunity to work hard and learn the true value of integrity. He had navigated through the absolute worst kind of toxic parenting and somehow emerged with a clean, honest soul. He had chosen the difficult path of truth over the comfortable path of lies. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key to the security gate. I did not say a single word. I simply slid the key into the heavy iron lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet morning air. I pushed the heavy metal gates open wide, breaking the absolute boundary I had established yesterday. I stepped aside and motioned for him to enter my property. Cameron picked up his heavy canvas bags and walked through the open gates, leaving the fake outside world completely behind. I locked the gate securely behind him. The silent correction had completely removed the rot from my family tree, but it had also perfectly preserved the only branch that was actually capable of bearing real fruit. We began the long walk up the gravel driveway together, ready to start building a completely honest future. We walked side by side up the long gravel driveway, leaving the heavy iron gates far behind us. The morning sun was climbing higher into the clear blue sky, rapidly warming the cool air and drying the muddy ground where my son had knelt just 24 hours prior. Cameron carried his 2 heavy canvas duffel bags without complaint. His breathing was steady, and his posture remained completely straight. I led him past the main house and directed him toward the detached garage. A sturdy wooden staircase on the exterior wall led up to a modest apartment nestled directly under the pitched roof. I walked up the steps ahead of him and pushed the solid wooden door open. The space inside was clean, simple, and entirely functional. It held a basic iron bed frame, a small wooden dresser, and a quiet view of the surrounding forest. It lacked the imported crystal chandeliers and the expensive Italian marble he was accustomed to, but it possessed something far more valuable. It offered absolute peace and the quiet dignity of a space earned through honest intention. Cameron dropped his heavy bags onto the braided rug. He looked around the small room and let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had been gripping his shoulders for the past week seemed to instantly evaporate. He looked at me and offered a sincere, quiet thank you. I nodded and told him to come back downstairs when he was ready. I walked back out into the bright morning light and headed straight toward my woodworking shop. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pushed the wide doors open, letting the fresh air circulate through the dusty room. The familiar, comforting scent of raw timber, boiled linseed oil, and metal shavings filled my lungs. This was my sanctuary. This was the place where raw materials were transformed into items of lasting value through patience and dedicated physical effort. I walked over to the center of the room where a large canvas tarp draped heavily over a massive object. I waited there, listening to the sound of the birds singing in the old-growth oak trees outside. A few minutes later, I heard the crunch of gravel approaching the open doors. Cameron stepped inside the shop. He looked around at the walls lined with heavy steel hand tools, the massive cast-iron table saw, and the thick wooden workbenches scarred by decades of continuous use. He took in the environment with the sharp, analytical eye of a trained architect. He recognized the profound difference between a fake corporate office designed for show and a real workshop designed for actual creation. I placed my hand on the edge of the heavy canvas tarp and pulled it back in one smooth motion. The thick fabric slid off the piece of furniture, resting in the center of the room, revealing the project I had spent the last 3 months carefully constructing. The morning sunlight streamed through the open doorway, and caught the deep, rich red and brown tones of the solid mahogany wood. It was a massive traditional executive desk built entirely by hand. The surface was incredibly smooth, polished to a glass-like finish that reflected the light with a warm natural glow. The drawers were perfectly flush with the frame fitted with hand-cut dovetail joints that required absolute precision and immense patience to execute properly. The legs were thick and sturdy, designed to bear significant weight and stand firmly rooted to the floor. It was a piece of furniture built to last for generations. It was the exact opposite of the cheap disposable illusions his parents had constructed. Cameron walked slowly toward the desk. His eyes were wide with genuine appreciation. He ran his hand gently along the polished front edge, feeling the solid, unbroken grain of the ancient mahogany tree. He leaned down to inspect the complex joinery, marveling at the seamless transition between the different pieces of wood. He recognized the hundreds of hours of grueling physical labor and intense focus required to build something of this magnitude. I stood beside him and told him the history of the wood. I explained that I had purchased this specific mahogany timber over a decade ago, saving it for a project that truly mattered. I told him I started planning the dimensions and cutting the first boards the exact same week he began his final semester of architectural school. I explained that a man entering a challenging profession needs a solid foundation to work upon. He needs a space where he can sit down, organize his thoughts, and build his own future based on hard work and honest calculations. Cameron stood up straight and looked at me, his eyes shining with a deep, unspoken emotion. He realized that while his parents were busy planning a massive fake graduation party to impress wealthy investors, I had been standing alone in this dusty workshop, quietly building a monument to his actual achievement. I reached into the front pocket of my faded denim jeans. I pulled out a small, heavy ring holding 3 polished brass keys. I held the keys out toward him, resting them in the palm of my calloused hand. I told him that these keys unlocked the deep side drawers of the mahogany desk. I explained that the desk now belonged entirely to him. It was my official graduation gift. I told him it was the first piece of furniture for his new life. Cameron reached out and took the brass keys. His hand brushed against mine, and I could feel the solid strength in his grip. He did not offer empty, boastful promises the way his father always did. He did not claim he was going to conquer the world or become a massive corporate success. He simply looked down at the keys and promised that he would never take the desk or the lesson behind it for granted. He promised to treat the wood with respect and to ensure that whatever work he produced while sitting behind it would be entirely honest and true. I looked at the young man standing in front of me and knew with absolute certainty that the family legacy was finally secure. The toxic entitlement that had poisoned my son had completely bypassed my grandson. I turned away from the desk and walked over to the long wooden workbench resting against the far wall. I picked up a heavy leather tool belt and tossed it onto the wooden surface. I pointed to a stack of rough, unsanded oak boards waiting in the corner of the shop. I told Cameron that the desk was his, but the small apartment above the garage required payment through daily sweat and blistered hands. I instructed him to grab a sanding block and start smoothing down the rough edges of the oak timber. I told him we had a long day of hard work ahead of us, and we were going to start entirely from the beginning. Cameron smiled a genuine, relaxed smile. He slipped the brass keys safely into his pocket and walked over to the workbench. He picked up the heavy sanding block, feeling the coarse grit against his palm. He took his place beside me at the wooden bench, and we began to work together in comfortable, productive silence. The rhythmic sound of the sanding block scraping against the raw oak filled the quiet workshop. It was the sound of a completely new chapter. The massive storm of federal fraud, fake wealth, and profound family betrayal was completely over. The silent correction had removed the destructive elements from my life and left behind only what was real and enduring. I had lost a son to the corrupting influence of unearned arrogance, but I had gained a grandson who possessed the quiet strength to build a legitimate, meaningful life. We stood side by side in the dusty sunlit room, surrounded by the smell of raw wood and the promise of a truly honest future. The old toxic legacy was completely dead, and a new, respectful foundation had finally been established. The ultimate lesson of this story is that true wealth is never measured by the brand of a tailored suit or the size of a rented crystal chandelier. It is measured entirely by the integrity of your daily actions and the solid strength of the foundation you build with your own two hands. Blood alone does not forge a family, it simply provides an opportunity to create one. When that opportunity is deliberately squandered through massive greed and calculated deceit, those biological bonds must be ruthlessly severed to protect what is actually real. A life built on the shifting sands of stolen money and arrogant lies will always inevitably collapse, but a legacy carved from honest physical labor and mutual respect will stand completely unbreakable against any storm. If you believe that true respect is earned through unwavering honesty rather than simply demanded by shared blood, leave a comment sharing your own experience and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice.